I'm from the Netherlands, and I have a deep sense of justice. And through my work and in my life environment, I try in a little way to create a better world for everyone. I have worked in the development system for 20 years, working with the United Nations, civil society organizations on democratic governance, human rights, and gender equality and advancing women's rights. And tonight, I really wanted to discuss with you what it is that I see in my world has led me to try and advance gender equality, but also throughout my life, what I have seen has raised my awareness around these issues, but also really to impart a message that change is within us, and that leadership for change and leadership for gender equality and women's rights and awareness raising around that is really due to our own leadership, be it in politics, be it in the private sector, be it in the home. So to illustrate this, I will take you through my story and the story of my family. So I was born in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 1975. I was actually born in the Civil War, but that's besides the point. But I'm highlighting this because this is where my curiosity for the world really was established. I have been very keenly interested in international relations, in development cooperation, and I've been reading about this since I was very small. And this really instilled this sense of justice and sense of injustice in me, and sense of the need to have equality in the world, and particularly gender equality. And where does this gender equality issue come from? Clearly, and I believe this comes from the awareness that is raised in the household and in the family. And I will talk a bit about my parents. My parents clearly were born in a very different era than I was, and had very different environments around women's rights issues, and very many different stories around how the environment didn't enable women to progress in the same way as men. So my parents were born in 1945, just at the end of the Second World War, and the Dutch government was in the process of reconstruction. And the policies of the Dutch government at the time were very clear on the roles of men and women in society. Women were to stay at home, be the homemakers, take care of the children, the elderly, and make sure that the home was running. The men were out there building the economy, building the political system, and in the social and the public life. Clearly, this created an imbalance, but also highlighted the policies and the investments that were made at the time to advance education for women and women in the job in the workforce. In fact, it was not until 1956 that it was the first married woman was able to have a job in the civil service in the Netherlands. And I'm highlighting this just to flag the barriers that women had actually to work and to have a life of their own, and to have a sustainable life of their own with their families. And it was the first married woman working in the public service in 1956. And before that, women actually either were fired or lost their jobs or had to resign by the time they got married. This was also a period where there was the welfare state had not been established. There were some small pension schemes, but basically the community, the family, the religious institutions were the ones that would support the most vulnerable, and particularly also vulnerable women in society. This changed in the 1960s, where the welfare state really started to support people more equally in the Netherlands. And in 1974, there was a big change and more recognition of the different needs and rights of women in society. And this really propelled changes in women's rights. And I'm highlighting this because, of course, I was born in 1975. So the period that my parents grew up in was quite different to the period and the opportunities that I had as a woman. And I would like to also just to say that this environment that they lived in, of course, had implications on their own lives and their own leadership, on their own opportunities. So 1955 is a date that I want to highlight because this is the story of my father. My father's father passed away when my father was only 10. This is my granddad. He left behind a wife and 7 children, 4 girls and three boys. And clearly at the time when there was no welfare system, it was very difficult for women, and women weren't in the job market. It was very difficult for women to sustain a family. Luckily enough, the year before the passing of my grandfather, the company that my grandfather was working for institutionalized a small pension for widows. And that small pension for widows really made sure that she was able to support her family. Of course, this had a caveat. This had a caveat that not all siblings of the 7 children could be educated in the same way. And in fact, my 4 aunts are still disgruntled till today that they were unable to access opportunities for education because it was decided that only the boys would move into secondary or tertiary education and university education. So the opportunities for them were very limited. My mother's story is different but similar in some ways. She was born into a family of entrepreneurs. And the family of entrepreneurs were, of course, at the time, men. My great-granddad had a business. He passed it on to his son, my granddad. And my mother, born into a family of 3 girls and 1 boy, clearly did not have the opportunity to take on the family business. She was disgruntled about that lack of enabling environment and the social norms that hampered her ability to advance in leadership and in business and in entrepreneurship. The business failed in 1980s, and she, I think till today, still remains disgruntled that she, although she showed capacity, she worked in the business, and she was really able to move that business forward, she didn't get that opportunity because of the environment and the social norms that she was living in. So I have this sense of injustice or a sense of gender injustice that really I carry forward in my leadership, in my work. And I've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit. I'm lucky in that. And I've also made my career out of this sense of injustice and gender inequality that I have. And I try to be a leader in my own right and raising awareness also in fora like these. So my first travel that really struck me was when I went to Namibia. And I was still studying at the time, but I was lucky because my father-in-law was working in development. And he took me to some really remote schools in Namibia. And I started reading a lot more about education, about children growing up in remote and poor areas, and the imbalance that had. And also what struck me was the similarities across the world about women and their roles in society, and that women didn't necessarily need to progress in education, and their role was in the household. And I wanted to change this. I thought this was unjust, also because of the history that I had. I moved to Vanuatu after my university studies, and there I worked on HIV and AIDS and gender. And again, what struck me was the lack of leadership, lack of participation of women in decision-making around issues that affect their lives, and particularly HIV and AIDS and health issues really struck me as being gender blind in terms of the policies they were developing, in terms of the services that they were providing. But also there was not an understanding of the underlying causes, the social norms that really made women more vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. And that was issues around polygamy, issues around violence against women, which really needed to be addressed. So this leadership, this cross-sectoral angle of work is something that I wanted to change as well. In my own way, in my own leadership, in my own work. I worked in Kenya, Bhutan, and a number of countries on women in politics, which is something we will hear more from the speakers here today. And what strikes me, everywhere I go, there are so many similarities about women, why women do not progress in politics, and why it is that women are unable to access financing for campaigning, why it is that political parties, where they exist, do not have a culture of embracing women in leadership and supporting them in the campaign process. And a lot of it is about awareness and consciousness and behavior around how and why women can be good leaders. Women vote in some countries where we have done analysis also in my work. We see that women don't vote for women. They do not themselves believe that women can be good leaders. And this is a challenge that we need to change. And this is something that I really, I feel quite strongly about. Women can be leaders, and very strong leaders in their own right, in politics, in economics, in the social sector, in the private sector. So I have made this really my mission in life, and I am, privileged to be able to do that for my work. And I also, though, always go back and think about, what do I instill in my children? What did my parents instill in me? This sense of injustice, this sense of the need to address women's rights and to be a leader in the home and in making change happen. And I do that with my kids. I have 2 boys and a lovely husband. And I am proud to say that my boys are little gender advocates, because it's very important for both men and women to be able to engage in this change and in this leadership process. I will give you an example also where my kids keep me on my toes. My youngest son wanted my pink mug, which is my favorite mug. And I said, no, why would you want my mug? This is my mug. And I said, by the way, it's pink. And he looks at me and he goes, Mom, gender equality, doesn't matter if it's pink. So, he put me back in my place, and he's right. My eldest son just recently did a research on ancient Greece. And he looked at the role of women in Sparta versus the role of women in Athens. And I'm very proud. And he proudly says that actually the women in Sparta were more advanced. They were more free. They were more empowered. And I think these are really important things, and research that is conducted by boys that will then also perpetuate and make them more aware, and their children and the generations to come more aware, and little leaders, big leaders, hopefully in the future, in their own right. So I will stop there. I really would like to thank you for this opportunity. And I hope that through my story, I've been able to impart a sense of individual change and individual leadership that we can all think about, and how that change and leadership is generational. But we must also not forget that all the steps we make ahead, we can also see backlash in the change that we want to bring in parts. And I think that's also a lesson learned that we see across the globe, that nothing is a given, and that everything needs a conscious behavior and really motivation and dedication to change. So I thank you very much.